Okay, inshallah, we will begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feek, ya Talha. Okay, so we will start a new chapter today, chapter 32. al-Tarhīb min tarki as-salati muta'ammidan aw ikhrajuha an waqtiha tahawunan. So in this chapter, the author rahimahullah will mention hadith relating to warning people from abandoning the prayer intentionally or missing the prayer out of tahawunan, just out of laziness. So we have the concept of tarkus Ṣalāh, abandonment of prayer. And as we know, the prayer is considered to be the greatest act of worship in our religion, to the degree that there was a view amongst a number of scholars, although from the we can consider, or we can say maybe it was the minor opinion, the opinion of the minority of fuqaha amongst the four schools of thought, that the person who stops praying is a disbeliever. Or even though there is evidence to suggest that this was a popular opinion amongst companions and a number of the tabi'een. But this issue, as we will see, we will shed some light on it, inshallah. But before we really maybe look into the nitty-gritty details and issues of iman and kufr and takfir and what have you, I think it's just important to remember, purely just from a spiritual perspective, of the importance of prayer in our religion. I don't believe it's healthy that we just approach the topic of prayer from the perspective of fear and say, oh, if we don't pray then we become disbelievers. When the Prophet ﷺ spoke of prayer, he spoke about it not as a warning or as a threat, for not performing it, that is, but he often spoke about it with a great degree of love and admiration of the act itself, to the extent that he said, وَجُعِلَتْ قُرَّةَ عَيْنِي فِي الصَّلَاةِ, the coolness of my eyes has been placed in the prayer. And so you'll find a plethora of hadith which speak about the virtue and which speak about how the prayer brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And ultimately, we want to engage in these devotional acts of worship out of a sense of great love for these actions itself, and out of devotion, and not just merely out of fear of missing out. Yes, that element must exist, the fear of missing out of an act of worship, fear of being punished or being held accountable for missing an important act of worship. That definitely should be there. But ideally we should try to develop a stronger sense of attachment to our acts of worship. And that should really be the impetus for wanting to pray and offer our prayers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's read the first hadith. The first hadith, hadith 157, عن جابر بن عبد الله رضي الله عنهما قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بين الرجل وبين الشرك والكفر ترك الصلاة أخرجه مسلم. On the authority of Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhuma, he said, the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, between a man and polytheism and kufr is the abandonment of prayer. Meaning the thing that distinguishes a person between Islam and kufr and shirk, the key factor is that of the abandonment of prayer. Meaning if people abandon it, then they fall into kufr, they fall into disbelief. This, as we can clearly see, is a very strong evidence for those who uphold the view that tarkus Ṣalāh, abandonment of prayer, it leads to disbelief. Now, how do we understand that? There are a number of things we need to understand. Number one, what do we What does the Prophet ﷺ mean by kufr here? What does he mean by shirk here? And what does he mean by tarkus salah? These are important questions, because there isn't an agreed upon understanding to what the Prophet ﷺ meant by shirk and kufr and what he meant by tarkus salah. Let's start off with tarkus salah, abandonment of prayer. What does that mean? Does that mean, missing one prayer intentionally? Like, for example, out of laziness, you intentionally don't pray a prayer. And so if the time of the prayer elapses and you've missed the prayer, does that mean that you've fallen into kufr? Or does tarkus salah mean that you've abandoned it in totality, meaning you don't pray at all? I mean, they all agree that that is tarkus salah, right? But at what point does it become tarkus salah? Right? Is it missing one prayer? Is it missing a few prayers on a regular basis? I mean, there are some people, for example, who pray all their prayers apart from Fajr. Or there are some people that pray all their prayers apart from Isha, Salatul Isha. Here there is, a wide spectrum of opinions. Some ranging from the very strict and very harsh that say that yes, if you abandon one prayer intentionally, you have committed kufr, and that is attributed to some scholars. And there is a view, even you probably had, one scholar say that if you go to sleep and you intentionally do not put your alarm on because you don't want to wake up for Fajr, you wake up in the morning as a disbeliever. I mean, that clearly is not a view which is upheld by a majority of the scholars, all right? And in many ways, it can be quite a dangerous view, right? Because then that will open the door to the ramifications of that, which is, whether a person dies, whether that person is a Muslim or not, whether he's allowed, you're allowed to marry your daughters to such a person, whether he should be buried amongst the Muslims, and whether people should inherit his wealth or he should inherit somebody else's wealth. There are serious questions to be asked, okay? But the most important discussion really here is what is meant by shirk and kufr here. What is actually meant by shirk and kufr? Now, in the Hanbali school of thought, we say that kufr here is the actual disbelief. Right? It's the actual disbelief that takes you outside the fold of Islam. But the majority of the scholars don't uphold that view. Majority of the scholars, meaning in the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i school of thought, they say, no, this isn't the major kufr that takes you outside the fold of Islam. This is a lesser kufr. Right? A lesser kufr. And they have their evidences for that. Okay, they have their evidences for that. Most notably, right, the evidence is that they would use for this is, for example, Ḥadīth in Musnad Imam Ahmad. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Khamsu salawatin," that there are 5 prayers that Allah has obligated upon His servants. Man ahsana wudu'ahun, whoever does their wudu well and prays them well and prays them on time, فَأَتَمَّ رُكُوعَهُنَّ وَسُجُودَهُنَّ, and they do the ruku' and the sujood well and have khushu' in them, كَانَ لَهُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَهْدٌ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لَهُ, he has a promise from Allah that Allah will forgive him. He has an ahd, a covenant, agreement with Allah that Allah will forgive him if he prays his 5 prayers, he does them well, etc. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَفْعَلْ, but whoever doesn't do that, meaning whoever doesn't pray his 5 prayers and doesn't do them well, or doesn't do them well, فَلَيْسَ لَهُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَهْدٌ, then he has no promise from Allah. إِنْ شَاءَ غَفَرَ لَهُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ عَذَّبَهُ, if Allah wants, He will forgive him, or if He wills, He will punish him. So the hadith, and this is found in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, shows that if you pray, you are guaranteed this by Allah. But if you don't, then Allah can choose to forgive you, and He can choose to punish you. The fact that He mentions He can choose to forgive such a person indicates that that person didn't die as a disbeliever. Because if a person dies as a disbeliever, Allah will not forgive such a person. Right? I want to share with you an important passage from Al-Mughni by Ibn Qudama rahimahullah, which is an important text in, firstly it's a commentary of one of the earliest texts in Hanbali fiqh, Mukhtaṣar al and it's also a comparative encyclopedia in fiqh, one of the greatest works in comparative fiqh in our religion. So this is volume 3 of Al-Mughni, page 355, and here he mentions the different views amongst the scholars with regards to this topic, right? So he says Ar-Riwaya al-Thani, the second opinion of in the Hanbali school, is that a person who abandons the prayer, meaning doesn't pray at all, yuqtalu haddan, meaning he is to be executed, right, for not praying, but as a had, meaning as a punishment, ma'al hukmi bi islamihi, but he's still considered a believer. Kazzani al-muhsan, like an adulterer, meaning he can be executed, but he still dies a believer. وهذا اختيار أبي عبد الله بن بطة وأنكر قول من قال إنه يكفر. This is the view of Abi Abdullah ibn Battah, and he rejected the opinion of those who say he disbelieved. وذكر أن المذهب على هذا ولم يجد في المذهب خلاف فيه وهذا قول أكثر الفقهاء. He said this is a view, meaning he doesn't die as a disbeliever. This is the view of most of the fuqaha. وقول أبي حنيفة ومالك والشافعي. وروي عن حذيفة, and it was also reported from al-Hudhayfa, Hudhayfa companion, he said يأتي على الناس زمان لا يبقى معهم من الإسلام إلا قول لا إله إلا الله. There will come a time where no one will have anything of Islam other than the saying La ilaha illallah. That's all they will have, just La ilaha illallah. They won't have nothing else, no Ṣalāh even. فقيل له وما ينفعهم. So it was said to him, how will they benefit from that? How will they benefit with just La ilaha illallah? Because you have to pray, you have to fast. قال تنجيهم من النار. Okay, it will save them from the hellfire, right? It will save them from the hellfire. Now, obviously, other scholars will respond to this and say, well, that's all they knew of Islam. They didn't know about anything else. Meaning they didn't know that they had to pray, but that's how ignorant they were. And obviously, a person who has reached that level of ignorance, there might be a level of excuse because there was no one to teach them otherwise. And that could be a counter argument. And so, and then he goes on to mention, other evidences like Inna Allah harrama ala an-nar man qala la ilaha illallah. Allah has forbidden the hellfire for anyone who says La ilaha illallah. Meaning, if you have the basic testimony of faith and the basic belief in Allah, that will save you, according to these hadith. I mean, this is a view amongst some of the scholars. Likewise, يخرج من النار من قال لا إله إلا الله وكان في قلبه من الخير ما يزن بره. And Allah will take out from the hellfire whoever said La ilaha illallah, and the only thing he had of goodness in his heart, ma yazinu burra, like something that, like a grain of barley. That's the only goodness he had, implying that he had nothing else. He had no Ṣalāh, nothing. Allah will take him out the hellfire. And Allah will only take out believers from the hellfire. And these are generic hadith. This is found in Bukhari and Muslim. So then he says, Sallu ala man qala la ilaha. Pray upon anyone who said La ilaha illallah. Right? Pray upon anyone who says La ilaha illallah. Meaning pray over them. Then he says, and this is important, so he said, فَإِنَّ لَا نَعْلَمُ فِي عَصْرٍ مِنَ الْأَعْصَارِ أَحَدًا مِنْ تَارِكِ الصَّلَاةِ تُرِكَ تَغْسِيلُهُ. He said, this is Ibn Qudama. We don't know of any age, we don't know of any era, of any time when someone who abandoned the prayer was never washed, meaning his body was never washed after he died. وَالصَّلَاةُ عَلَيْهِ. And no one stopped praying over him. Meaning it was never a practical reality where someone, was killed as a result of not praying. It's unheard of. Like, it was maybe individual accounts here and there, but in practice, he said, we've never heard of that. وَدَفْنُهُ فِي مَقَابِرِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, and him being denied being buried in amongst Muslims. وَلَا مُنِعَ وَرَثَتُهُ وَمِيرَاثَهُ, and his and we've never heard of a person a person's heirs being denied their inheritance and their estate of the person who abandoned prayer. وَلَا مُنِعَ هُوَ مِيرَاثُ مُوَرِّثِهِ, nor was he denied as an heir, all right, denied the wealth of someone who died. وَلَا فُرِّقَ بَيْنَ زَوْجَيْنِ تَرْكِ الصَّلَاةِ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمَا, and we've never heard of a man and a wife being separated as a result of one of them abandoning the prayer. We've never heard of that. And that's important to note, because nowadays you hear fatwa, right? People being asked about, oh, my husband doesn't pray. Okay, and they say, well, it's haram for you to stay with him. You have to separate from him, leave. Right? Subhanallah. Okay, Ibn Qudama is saying we've never heard of this before. لا نعلم في عصر من الأعصار. We don't know of anyone from any era who would say such a thing. Despite مع كثرة تارك الصلاة, despite there being a number of people who wouldn't pray, right? So it's not like it's a common phenomenon, right, that people are not praying. This has always existed. ولو كان كافرا لثبتت هذه الأحكام كلها. And if he truly was a disbeliever, all of these rulings that we've mentioned above would have been applied. ولا نعلم بين المسلمين خلافا في أن تارك الصلاة يجب عليه قضاؤها. And we also do not know of any difference of opinion amongst the believers that the one who abandons the prayer must make up the prayers that he's missed. ولو كان مرتدا لم يجب عليه قضاء صلاة ولا صيام. And if he was a murtad, if he became an apostate for leaving the prayer, okay, then qada wouldn't be an obligation upon him. And then he goes on to explain the hadith that we have just read from Mukhtaṣar al Targhīb. How do we understand it? He says, وَأَمَّا الْأَحَادِيثَ الْمُتَقَدِّمَةِ فَهِيَ عَلَى سَبِيلِ التَّغْلِيظِ. As for the ahadith that we've mentioned before, that mention like the thing that separates us and the disbelievers, and between the thing that separates the believer from disbelief and shirk is the abandonment of prayer. He says the purpose for these, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned it ala sabil al-taghlīḍ. He only said it as a very strong warning, as a deterrent. وَالتَّشْبِيهِ لَهُ بِالْكُفَّارِ, and that he resembles the disbelievers. Not that he is literally a disbeliever. لا على الحقيقة, right? Not that he is literally a disbeliever. كقوله عليه السلام, just like the Prophet ﷺ said, سباب المسلم فسوق وقتاله كفر. Just as the Prophet ﷺ said, insulting the believer is evil and fighting him is kufr. Fighting him is kufr. He said fighting him is kufr. He didn't say do we say that? Does anyone say if you fight a believer you become a kafir? No. وقوله كفر بالله تبرؤ من نسب وإن دق. And it's also an act of disbelief. It's kufr billah. You've disbelieved in Allah. If you absolve yourself from your lineage, meaning you absolve your who you are attributed to in terms of your lineage and your father. وقوله من قال لأخيه يا كافر فقد باء بها أحدهما. And like when someone says to his brother, oh you kafir, then it goes back to one of the two. Either he's a kafir or you're a kafir. It doesn't literally mean that you are a kafir. And like the saying, من أتى حائضا أو امرأة في دبرها فقد كفر بما أنزل على محمد. And like the saying of the Prophet, whoever has intercourse with someone who's on her menses or from her backside, then he has disbelieved in what was sent down upon Muhammad. Right? He's disbelieved in the Quran. Now, does anyone say that if anyone does this act that they have become a kafir? Right? You'll find majority of scholars will say no to such a thing. Right? وقال ومن قال مطرنا بنوء الكواكب فهو كافر بالله مؤمن بالكواكب. Right? Incidentally, anyhow, but and this is a well-known saying or hadith. He says that whoever says مطرنا بنوء الكواكب, whoever says that it has rained due to the appearance of a particular star, فهو كافر بالله مؤمن بالكواكب, then he is a kafir in Allah and he is a believer in the stars, meaning he believes that the stars, right? And here the ruling actually depends, right? So if a person believes that the stars have an independent power in and of themselves, that they have a divine ability to, independently from Allah, okay, to cause rain to descend, they have that power and ability, then that's disbelief. But if a person believes that like Allah has given the star that ability, then that's a different ruling. That's not kufr, that takes you outside the fold of Islam. وَقَوْلُهُ مَنْ حَلَفَ بِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ فَقَدْ أَشْرَكَ, and whoever swears by other than Allah has disbelieved. So notice how, unfortunately, even these sayings are used by some people to say that whoever swears by other than Allah automatically has committed shirk and has become a mushrik straight away. But that is not how the classical scholars understand such an issue. Like the hadith, شَارِبُ الْخَمْرِ كَعَابِدِ وَثَنٍ, like the one who drinks alcohol, right, is like an idol worshipper. It's not literally intended. We don't literally say he's an idol worshipper. وأشباه هذه مما أريد به التشديد في الوعيد وهو أصوب القولين والله أعلم. And the likes of these. So we can see that what's been intended by these statements is tashdid, just to be very stern and harsh against people who say otherwise. To be harsh and stern against anyone who commits these acts is not to literally mean what they literally say. And Ibn Qudama, who's one of the greatest Hanbali scholars, he says, وَهُوَ أَصْوَبُ الْقَوْلَيْن. This is the more correct opinion of the two. Even though it's not technically the relied upon position in the Hanbali school, but his opinion carries great weight. So, that is the view of we can safely say the majority of the fuqaha, of the jurists. So the way we understand, according to that understanding, kufr here is not understood literally, right? But it's been used and is mentioned as a grave warning, that a person resembles disbelievers, but not that he literally becomes a disbeliever, right? And I think it's maybe important to note this view for a number of reasons. Not to say the other view is not strong. Not to say that the view that whoever abandons prayer is a disbeliever. Not to say that's a wrong opinion. That is the opinion of the official Hanbali school of thought. But I am worried and concerned about the consequences of people who hold this view and the way that they apply it. Especially considering where majority of the Muslims in the world, well, majority of the madhahib and the fuqaha don't hold that view. And secondly, if we're going to start breaking families and splitting marriages as a result of this and encouraging people to do that, then it's going to create huge problems. Okay, it's going to create huge problems. And the way to deal with this, I believe, is it's not just to condemn people to the hellfire, but to try and bring them back and encourage them. That should be the key focus, to encourage people to start praying again, to encourage them to rekindle their attachment to the prayer itself. Well, Allah knows best. And some, even if we were to take this hadith literally, we can still argue that yes, abandonment of prayer as a result of someone who considers abandonment of prayer to be permissible, right? So whoever considers that it's absolutely fine to abandon prayer and not pray at all, then then this is rejecting something which is clearly known in our religion to be an obligation, and so that would be an act of disbelief. Right. The next hadith, 158. وعن بريدة رضي الله عنه سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول العهد الذي بيننا وبينهم الصلاة فمن تركها فقد كفر. In this hadith it says the covenant الذي بيننا وبينهم الصلاة, the distinguishing covenant that is between us and them, the disbelievers, is the prayer. So whoever abandons it has disbelieved. That's reported by Ahmad and Abu Dawood. And the author, al-Musannif, he says, ذهب جماعة من الصحابة والتابعين إلى كفر من ترك الصلاة وقال به من الفقهاء النخعي والحكم ابن عتيبة وابن المبارك وأحمد وإسحاق وأقول بعد الشافعية. And he said, the author rahimahullah, he said, جماعة من الصحابة, a group of companions and tabi'een, they were of the view that it's disbelief to abandon the prayer. And this was also the view of some fuqaha, of the following fuqaha, al-Nakha'i, al-Hakim ibn Utayba, Abd al-Mubarak, and Ahmad and Ishaq, and also some of the Shafi'is. But as we can see, it's not an agreed upon matter, and scholars do differ over it. Okay, the next, so that concludes that section. The next section is Kitab al-Nawafil. We'll speak about hadith relating to Nawafil, recommended prayers, and he will mention a number of chapters, so 17 chapters. So we'll speak about, praying the 12 rak'ahs during the day, the virtues of the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr and before Dhuhr and Asr, and between Maghrib and Isha and Witr, Qiyam al-Layl, Duha, Tasbih, Tawbah, etc. So we'll speak about all of those, inshallah. So chapter 1, الترغيب في المحافظة على 12 ركعة نافلة في اليوم والليلة. An encouragement to observe consistently the 12 rak'ahs as nafila in a day and night, on a daily basis. حديث 159 عن أم حبيبة رملة بنت أبي سفيان رضي الله عنهما قالت سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول ما من عبد مسلم يصلي لله تعالى في كل يوم 12 ركعة تطوعا غير فريضة إلا بنى الله له بيتا في الجنة. رواه مسلم وأصحاب السنن. So on the authority of Habiba, may Allah be pleased with her, she said, I heard the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, there is no believer who prays for Allah every day 12 rak'ahs, supererogatory 12 rak'ahs, other than the obligatory prayers, except that Allah will build for him a house in paradise. And it's reported by Muslim. And this hadith mentions 12, and it doesn't mention what those 12 rak'ahs are, when they're prayed, etc. It just says whoever prays 12 rak'ahs other than an obligatory prayer. Okay, so that's according to that version of the hadith. He then mentions Wazad al-Tirmidhi, but then in the version of al-Tirmidhi, it does mention it in some detail. أربع قبل الظهر, so 4 rak'ahs before Dhuhr, ركعتين بعدها, 2 after Dhuhr, وركعتين بعد المغرب, and 2 rak'ahs after Maghrib, وركعتين بعد العشاء, and 2 rak'ahs after Isha, وركعتين قبل صلاة الغداة, and 2 rak'ahs before the morning prayer. And then he says وصححها ابن خزيمة وابن حبان الحاكم. So this was authenticated by Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban al-Hakim. However, لكن لم يذكروا ركعة العشاء, ركعتي العشاء. However, they did not mention the 2 rak'ahs of Isha. وذكروا بدلهما, and instead of mentioning the 2 rak'ahs after Isha, they narrated وركعتين قبل العصر, 2 rak'ahs before Asr. وكذا عند النسائي في رواية. Right, and so another version mentions ركعتين, 2 rak'ahs before Dhuhr and 2 rak'ahs before Asr. So we can see, right, that there is some discrepancies in the different narrations when it comes to breaking down what these 12 rak'ahs are. Now, it must be noted that in the Hanbali school, the 12 rak'ahs, the daily rawatib, are actually 10 and not 12. And it's not that they were unaware of this hadith. There are other hadith to this effect as well, and there are a number of reports that mention 12. However, we need to understand, as we will see, there are many other hadith that encourage people to pray even beyond these 12. So some hadith mention, the 4 rak'ahs before Asr. May Allah have mercy upon, whoever prays 4 rak'ahs before Asr. But despite that, we don't include the 4 rak'ahs to be a part of the daily rawatib, the daily fixed sunnahs. So here we need to understand, and we need to distinguish between what has been encouraged and what did the Prophet ﷺ regularly perform. So in the Hanbali school, we actually say that it's 10 rak'ahs and not 12, meaning the Prophet ﷺ regularly prayed 10 rak'ahs, 2 before Fajr, 2 before Dhuhr, 2 after Dhuhr, 2 after Maghrib, and 2 after Isha. That's not to say that he didn't pray 12. Sometimes he prayed 12. But Ibn Umar, he said, I memorized from the Prophet ﷺ that he would always pray 10 rak'ahs, meaning that's what he did habitually. Otherwise, there are hadith that encourage to pray 4 after Dhuhr even, 4 before Dhuhr, before Asr, 4 after Isha as well. And some hadith that encourage people to pray 6 after Maghrib. So we need to distinguish between those hadith that encourage people to pray more, or to pray an X amount of rak'ahat, and to understand what was his daily habit. Right? So that's an important thing to distinguish, and that's why the Hanbalis say that the daily rawatib was actually 10 and not 12. But that doesn't mean that you don't pray 12 rak'ahs. If you want to pray 12, alhamdulillah, and that's great. And if you do that regularly, that's even it's a very good thing to do. But if you want to follow the footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of what he would always perform on a daily basis, generally speaking, then according to the Hanbali school, it was actually 10 rak'ahs and not 12. Right. So let's break these rak'ahs down. And so, again, looking at these rak'ahs from a putting aside the technicalities of it, what is significant about sunnah prayers, about these sunnah prayers? Firstly, the key difference between a sunnah and an obligation, right? An obligation is something you must do. If you don't do, you are sinful. And they are the key things that we use to bring ourselves closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hence the Prophet ﷺ said in Hadith Qudsi that my servant does not draw closer to me with anything more beloved to me than the fara'id, than the obligatory actions. But then my servant continues to draw closer to me with the nawafil, حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ, until I love him. Right? Meaning, when the servant, he wants to excel, right? He wants to get even higher and closer to Allah, to the degree that he earns the love of Allah. Then that's through the nawafil. That's the sign the person wants more. That's one issue. The second issue is the nawafil also have a specific, or the daily sunnah mu'akkada, rawatib. They also have another function, which is that they help to make up for the shortcomings in our obligatory prayers. Right? So if you are lax, if you lose concentration in your obligatory prayers, if you fall short, then your sunnah prayers will help cover up for those shortcomings in the obligatory, help to cover the shortcomings in your obligatory prayers. So 10 rawatib and plus 2 duha. So duha is obviously something a person would perform regularly, but whether, for him, as a lot of his regular prayers aren't binding upon us or expected from us, like his, tahajjud prayers. But if a person wants to pray on a regular basis, that's fine. But it's not one of those prayers that a person is expected to pray, like the daily rawatib. And also Salat al-Duha has a slightly different function as well, in that, it's prayed for gratitude. Like a person who prays it has given his daily share or his daily portion of shukr, gratitude. The problem with using StreamYard so people can ask questions in person is it's a fairly just the process of getting people, inviting them on and accepting them on. It might be a bit fiddly. That's the only issue, right? Okay. Right. So taking that into consideration, let's look at chapter 2 here. Now we're going to break down the individual recommended prayers. So الترغيب في المحافظة على ركعتي الفجر, an encouragement to pray the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr habitually. Ḥadīth 160. عن عائشة رضي الله عنها عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ركعتا الفجر خير من الدنيا وما فيها, رواه مسلم والترمذي. وفي لفظ لمسلم لهما أحب إلي من الدنيا جميعا. وفي لفظ لم يكن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على شيء من النوافل أشد تعاهدا منه على ركعتي الفجر, متفق عليه. Aisha رضي الله عنها reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, the 2 rak'ahs of Fajr are more beloved to the dunya, are better than the whole dunya and what they contain, and what it contains. The 2 rak'ahs of Fajr are better than the whole dunya and what it contains. And this is reported by Muslim and at-Tirmidhi. What does that mean? What does it mean when we say the 2 rak'ahs of Fajr, meaning the 2 rak'ah sunnah is better than the whole dunya and what it contains? This means that imagine how a person would feel if they had the wealth of the entire dunya. How would you feel? You would feel as though you have attained so much, right? That you have so much wealth, it's just unmeasurable. But the person who prays his 2 rak'ah for Fajr in the Akhirah, when he receives the reward for praying the 2 rak'ah of before Fajr, he will feel just as a person would have felt possessing the entire dunya, indicating that the reward that he gets for praying his Fajr prayers, his Sunnah prayers for Fajr, are indeed immense. But then this begs the question, what's specific, what's special about the Fajr prayer, the Sunnah for Fajr prayer? To understand this, we all know that Fajr prayer is one of the prayers which are difficult to wake up for, because people are usually asleep, and getting up from sleep, it's a struggle. And hence in the adhan for Fajr, as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, prayer is better than sleep. So it indicates a great deal of juhud and sacrifice. Okay, if that is the case, then why not apply this to the 2 fard? Because fard is surely more important than surely more important than sunnah. Okay, that's true. But think about it. Often many people will wake up for Fajr and they just want to do the bare minimum because they're so tired and groggy. They just want to do the fard and go back to sleep. Indicating, which is reflective of, their attitude. Right? But now if a person insists they want to pray the 2 rak'ah sunnah, then that's an indication that they're really striving against their nafs, because now they're really tired and they could say to themselves, I'm just going to do the obligatory and then go back to sleep. But now they want to do more, which indicates a higher degree of mujahada, a higher degree of striving against one's nafs. But also the added benefit of praying the 2 rak'ah sunnah actually helps you and prepares you to pray your obligatory prayer in the best possible way. And hence the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was that he would pray these 2 rak'ahs relatively quickly, right? So to get him nasheed, meaning so that he would be active and alert and awake, and he would be praying in a state of full awareness. And so it is seen as an introduction, and that's why the sunnah for Fajr is what we call a sunnah qabliya, not ba'diyya. It's a sunnah which occurs before the obligatory prayer, not after. And so if you notice, when it comes to the sunnah prayers, there are sunnah qabliya and ba'diyya. There are sunnahs which are prayed before and sunnahs which are prayed afterwards. Notice how it's in particular the sunnah qabliya are established for Salatul Fajr and Salatul Dhuhr. And what's unique about, because the sunnah for Asr, there's no real established sunnah mu'akkada before Asr. There's no real established sunnah before Maghrib, nor is there an established sunnah before Salatul Isha. There are some differences we'll discuss of the other prayers later. Okay. In the Hanafi school, there is the sunnah of 4 before Isha. We'll discuss that later as well. But what's, specific about Fajr and Dhuhr, that requires, or that encourages us to pray a sunnah before the obligatory prayer. This is because of the large, as many scholars have said, the large time gap between Fajr and its previous prayer, and between Dhuhr and its previous prayer. So because you haven't prayed in a long time, because when you pray your Fajr, the last time you prayed was many hours before. Okay, for us in the UK maybe it's a bit different, because the gap between Fajr and Isha is very short at the moment in summer. But normally it's quite long. And so your last experience of prayer would have been a relatively long time ago. So again, to prepare yourself, right, for the obligatory prayer, you pray a sunnah prayer before. And you pray relatively short, and hence this is one of the reasons why it's a sunnah to recite a short surah, Surah al-Kafirun and Ikhlas. Right, they're short prayers. They're short surahs, and so it prepares you for the prayer itself, the obligatory prayer. And there are also nap times as well. Yeah. So yes, so you will be in a state of, you'll be fairly lethargic. You'll be fairly tired. Right, people often, obviously, they wake up for Fajr, and a lot of people have their siesta at midday. But no, you're not wrong. That's not wrong. So there could be more than one reason, right? So, yeah, okay, right. So that's for the 2 rakahs for Fajr. The chapter 3, al-Targhīb fi Ṣalāh qabla al-Dhuhri wa ba'daha. The encouragement to pray before Dhuhr and after Dhuhr. So Ḥadīth 161 عن أم حبيبة رضي الله عنها قالت سمعت الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من حافظ على 4 ركعات قبل الظهر و4 بعدها حرمه الله على النار. رواه أحمد وأصحاب السنن وصححه الترمذي. So the authority of Habiba رضي الله عنها, who also said, I heard the Messenger say, whoever regularly prays 4 before Dhuhr and 4 after it, Allah will make the hellfire prohibited for that person. That's reported by Ahmad and the Sunan as well, Tirmidhi, etc. So do you see, right, how there are numerous hadith, and there are more like this, that encourage people to in fact pray more than 12. But we don't say it's therefore the daily sunnah mu'akkada are 14. Right, so based upon this account, this version mentioned, it will end up being 14 rakahs. Right? So the idea is we need to sift through the ahadith and see, okay, we need to distinguish between those that the Prophet generally encouraged and that which he would regularly pray, that we can say these are the sunnah mu'akkada. And that is the approach that the Hanbali scholars used. The next hadith 162 وعن عبد الرحمن ابن حميد عن أبيه عن جده أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال صلاة الهجير مثل الليل يعني إذا زالت الشمس رواه الطبراني. On the authority of Abdurrahman ibn Humayd, on the authority of his father, on the authority of his grandfather, the Messenger ﷺ said, Salatul Hajir mithlul layl. In this hadith is Salatul Hajir. So Hajir means like midday, meaning the prayer offered at midday, right? It says mithlul layl, but the actual version in al-Tabarani mentions min salatil layl, right? Meaning its reward, it's like that of Salatul Layl. Meaning the sunnah that you pray, okay, for Salatul Dhuhr is like the reward of praying Qiyamul Layl. Yeah, this hadith is somewhat, questionable in terms of authenticity, but we can see the similarity in the sense that Salatul Dhuhr is the first prayer a person would pray, okay, after their overall sleep, okay, because meaning that some people will go to sleep after Fajr, and then there will be other people who might stay awake after Fajr, but they'll have an afternoon nap. Okay, so they will wake up from their sleep to pray. They will wake up from their sleep to pray, and not just that, they'll pray their sunnahs as well. So that's an indication. That's what you do in tahajjud, right? In tahajjud, what do? You go to sleep and then wake up and pray. So from that perspective, it's similar. Okay, it's similar. Right. The next one, chapter 4, al-Targhīb في الصلاة قبل العصر. The encouragement to pray before صلاة العصر. روي عن أم سلمة رضي الله عنها عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: من صلى 4 ركعات قبل العصر حرم الله بدنه على النار. رواه الطبراني وأخرج في الأوسط. Whoever prays 4 rak'ahs before Asr, Allah makes the hellfire forbidden to touch his body. Allah makes it forbidden for the hellfire to touch his body. And other similar narrations to that. So again, the added virtue of praying. If you pray these 4, generally, you pray them in 2 rak'ahs in units of 2, but there's no harm if you pray them in 4 in one go as well. That's also permissible. Otherwise, the hadith, it says, Salatul Layli wa Nahari Mathna Mathna. The recommended prayers, whether you pray them at night or during the day, are prayed in units of 2. Okay, I think we will stop there for today, inshallah, because we'll probably have quite a bit to say regarding the sunnahs between Maghrib and Isha. So we'll conclude on that point, inshallah. Okay, some people were asking me about the audio recordings for these lessons. Yeah, so I do have a sort of a new mic setup, so which is proving to be a bit difficult to record the audio separately, but that's something we will try and arrange in the forthcoming classes, inshallah. But for now, just follow us on YouTube, inshallah. I mean, this class, that is. We'll conclude. If there are any questions or comments that you would like to ask, feel free to ask now, inshallah. Yeah, inshallah. I mean, I like StreamYard. StreamYard is it's a good product. Okay. Looks as though there aren't any questions or comments. If that is the case, I think we will conclude there for today, inshallah. Okay. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody, and inshallah I shall see you next week, inshallah. Subhanaka rabbi hamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.